He had pardoned everyone. After Pharsalus, Caesar did not post proscription lists. He did not confiscate estates. He pardoned Brutus, Cassius, Cicero. One by one, the senators of the Republic accepted the offer. They calculated the exchange rate of survival, and they took it. In Utica, on the North African coast, one man had not yet decided. Marcus Porcius Cato understood what a pardon was. A man who holds the power to forgive does not stand beside you as an equal. He stands above you as a sovereign. Every senator who accepted Caesar's mercy had, in that act, conceded that the Republic was finished and that one man now ruled in its place. Cato was not willing to concede this. In the small hours before dawn, he reached for the sword that hung at the head of his bed. His hand found empty air. What is the ultimate price a man will pay to deny his enemy the pleasure of forgiveness? As the dust of Utica settled in 46 BC, the Roman Republic was already bleeding out. Caesar's invincible legions were marching upon the gates, wielding a weapon far more insidious than the sword: forced mercy. To accept his pardon was to surrender one's soul, transforming proud senators into mere subjects of an emerging dictator. Cornered in his chambers, Marcus Porcius Cato looked down at his own stitched abdomen, refusing to be a living trophy. Will he submit to a tyrant's grace, or will he physically tear himself apart to ensure the Republic dies free? It was not forged in the grand halls of Rome, but on the desolate edge of the African continent. The dust of Utica. The winds of April in the year 46 BC carried the bitter taste of dust and defeat across the North African coast. The Mediterranean Sea, vast and indifferent, crashed against the fortified walls. The Roman Republic, an ancient, intricate machinery of law, tradition, and oligarchic privilege that had governed the Mediterranean for centuries, was already a corpse. The civil war that had violently torn the Roman world apart since Gaius Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon 3 years earlier had cascaded into a series of catastrophic fractures. Its legions had been systematically dismantled on the plains of Pharsalus. Now, they were entirely shattered in the dry, unforgiving dust of Thapsus. News of the slaughter, where forces under Quintus Caecilius Metellus Pius Scipio Nasica and Juba I were systematically dismantled, washed into the harbor of Utica like a tide of ash. Caesar's war machine had crushed them. Elephants had panicked and lines had broken. The Republican resistance was rapidly narrowing down to this single coastal citadel. The architecture of evacuation. Commanding the garrison at Utica was Marcus Porcius Cato, known to history as Cato the Younger. He was a man carved from the unyielding marble of ancient Roman virtue. He was the great-grandson of Cato the Censor, the inflexible priest of Apollo, and the absolute embodiment of uncompromising stoicism. Stationed at Dyrrhachium, a vital rear supply base, Cato received the shattering news of Pompey's crushing defeat by Caesar at Pharsalus. Acting swiftly, he gathered the remaining forces and fleet left in Dyrrhachium and set sail across the Mediterranean Sea. He had marched the remnants of the Republican army from Cyrene across the blistering Libyan desert, enduring a 7-day trek through sandstorms. According to the histories, Cato walked on foot at the head of the column, refusing to ride a horse. He drank only when his men drank, matching their exhaustion step for step. Arriving in Utica in early 47 BC, near the end of winter, Cato assumed command as the defense governor of this vital rear fortress. For a little over a year, he governed the city and systematically fortified its defenses. Now, he is 49 years old. His face was shaved for the first time since the death of Pompey, years earlier. He had let his beard grow, as a sign of mourning for a republic already gutted, before it had formally died. He had laid down that mourning now. Not because he had found reason for hope. Because he was finished with the visible expression of grief. News arrived of the disaster at Thapsus, where the Republican commander Metellus Scipio had seen his legions crushed by Caesar's veterans. The surviving cavalry fled to Utica. As the shattered remnants of the resistance poured into the city, he did not panic. He did not weep for the lost legions. Following their annihilation at Thapsus, the Republican cavalry and remnants of the shattered army fled to Utica, consumed by absolute panic and madness. Suspecting the citizens of Utica of harboring secret loyalty to Caesar, they demanded a gruesome price for defending the city: the total massacre of the inhabitants and the division of their wealth. But Cato was a man bound by law, principle, and the unyielding tenets of Stoic philosophy. He resolutely refused this barbaric demand to slaughter fellow Romans and allied citizens. With their ultimatum rejected, the cavalry and mercenaries, possessing no genuine will to fight, abandoned Utica and scattered into the night. Cato attempted to organize a defense, ordering the gates barricaded and weapons distributed. The local magistrates and the council of 300 Roman businessmen who formed his makeshift senate hesitated. They calculated the exchange rate of Caesar's pardon. Cato gathered his inner circle and the council of 300. He looked at the faces of men who had already begun shifting their allegiances. He instructed them to save themselves, to open the gates to the approaching dictator, and to accept the pardon that would render them subjects in the guise of free men. He refused to join them. Cato told his friends he would not allow the tyrant to possess the glory of saving his life. To accept the gift of life from a man who had no legal authority to dispense it was to participate in the republic's degradation. His friends pleaded with him. Some suggested he seek exile, or lead a fleet to Spain. Cato dismissed the proposals. He spent the afternoon securing passage on ships for those who wished to flee, signing warrants, and distributing funds from the public treasury. He meticulously audited the accounts, so that no one could accuse him of embezzlement in his final hours. He moved with bureaucratic precision, finalizing the paperwork of a dying state. He did not ride out to the city walls to look upon the approaching victor, nor did he dispatch envoys to negotiate terms of surrender. Instead, he looked to the harbor and moved with a methodical, terrifying calm. He managed the final logistics of the port. He orchestrated a maritime evacuation, securing grain, distributing funds, and ordering the ships in the harbor to take the fleeing refugees. He held the line of defense solely to secure the physical escape of the remaining senatorial personnel, equestrian knights, and local allies. He watched the vessels slip into the Mediterranean, carrying the survivors of a dying political order across the water. The surviving troops reorganized, dragging Caesar into the colossal and harrowing Battle of Munda, a year later in 45 BC. His decision to remain inside his quarters was not rooted in a fatalistic surrender, but in a precise, devastating political calculus. The weapon of mercy. The Republic, the actual, functioning republic of senators and consuls and centuries-old procedural argument, had been dying for decades before Cato was born. It was a system designed for a city-state, then stretched across a Mediterranean empire. It had never been built to govern. The machinery of the old constitution, the annually elected consuls, the sovereign senate, the citizen assemblies, the unwritten but iron principle that no single man should hold power for too long, all of it had been rusting and creaking since the time of the Gracchi. By the time Cato came of age, the system was held together largely by habit and by the willingness of powerful men to pretend that the old forms still meant what they once had. Cato refused to pretend. This was his defining quality. It made him, in the eyes of most Romans, a fanatic. It made him, in the eyes of history, a monument. He walked barefoot through the streets of Rome during summer, because senators were meant to maintain austerity. He wore his toga without a tunic in all weather, because his ancestor Cato the Elder had done the same. He prosecuted corrupt quaestors when he became quaestor himself. It was an act so unusual that the defendants came to court expecting the customary leniency and left facing charges. When Caesar pushed through agrarian legislation as consul, using methods that were technically legal but practically coercive, Cato filibustered from the rostra for hours until Caesar ordered him physically dragged off. When Caesar sent soldiers to the Senate floor to intimidate votes, Cato was the one man who kept talking, who kept objecting, who refused to register that the room had changed. His obstruction was total and, in the end, politically counterproductive. His refusal to give Pompey any accommodation helped drive Pompey into alliance with Caesar. This created the first triumvirate, which accelerated precisely the concentration of power Cato had spent his career preventing. He had turned Caesar from a dangerous political rival into an existential threat. He had refused compromise at every moment, when compromise might have preserved something. His righteousness had helped build the world he was dying to refuse. His principles were intact. The Republic was not. The Senate had spent centuries building institutional bulwarks against autocracy, layering vetoes, tribunician rights, and consular term limits over the ashes of the ancient monarchy. Caesar bypassed the architecture of the state entirely. He utilized the military imperium granted to him in Gaul to forge an army loyal to his coin rather than the Republic. Then he crossed the Rubicon to weaponize the legal apparatus of Rome against itself. When the senatorial forces fractured and fled, Caesar did not confiscate their estates. He restored their property. He handed them administrative titles. He transformed former adversaries into complicit functionaries. This was the ultimate dead end for the defenders of the old order. The legal framework of the Republic required two equal factions to debate, legislate, and compromise within the bounds of the law. Caesar's unilateral forgiveness eliminated the opposition by deleting their agency. The laws were not broken. They were rendered obsolete by a man who placed himself outside their jurisdiction, granting life and death as personal favors rather than state decrees. Julius Caesar was marching upon the province, approaching the gates of Utica, not with the proscription lists of Lucius Cornelius Sulla, which demanded the severed heads of political rivals, but carrying a weapon far more insidious, permanent, and absolute. He brought Clementia. He brought the tactical, calculated application of mercy. After Pharsalus, when Pompey's legions broke and ran, Caesar did not proscribe the survivors. He did not auction their property or post their names on lists. He pardoned them. Brutus, who had fought against him, was pardoned and promoted. Cassius, who had served Pompey, was made a legate. Cicero, who had fulminated against Caesar for years, was invited to come home and resume his public life. The message was explicit and systematic. Caesar wins, Caesar forgives, Caesar rules. The mercy was real. In the modern lexicon, mercy carries a gentle, moral resonance. But in the rigid, hyper-competitive world of the late Roman Republic, Clementia was a weapon of profound subjugation. The Republic was founded on the concept of libertas, not a universal democratic freedom, but the specific, fiercely guarded equality and class privilege of the senatorial elite. When one aristocrat holds the extra-constitutional authority to pardon another, that equality is instantly annihilated. By forgiving his enemies, Caesar stripped them of their status as equal combatants in a civil war. A pardon can only be granted by a sovereign to a subject. It was to legitimize Caesar's illegal monopoly on state violence. It was to concede that the ancient constitution had been permanently replaced by the whim of one man. By publicly pardoning his defeated Roman enemies, men who had fought bitterly against him, Caesar established an unbreakable patron-client dynamic. He transformed his former aristocratic peers, the proud senators of Rome, into his political dependents. They would owe their very breath to his magnanimity. To accept this pardon was to publicly acknowledge the total supremacy of the dictator. It was the forced transition of the Republic into an empire of granted favors, a system where the rigid laws of the Senate were instantly replaced by the personal grace of a single conqueror. To survive physically by Caesar's grace was to die politically. For Cato, the Republic's most intransigent defender, accepting Caesar's pardon was an existential impossibility. It would mean acknowledging that Caesar held the extra-constitutional authority to grant life or death. To live by Caesar's grace was to admit that the Republic was dead and that a monarch now ruled. Caesar had written in his letters that his mercy was his new way of conquering, but Cato, whose entire life was a monument to the law, despised this clemency. He would not be conquered by the forgiveness of a tyrant. Marcus Porcius Cato, the ideological anchor of the conservative optimates, understood the architecture of this trap. He saw that Caesar's clemency was a mechanism designed to turn the senators of Rome into an indebted caste of political eunuchs. Cato realized that the only weapon left to a defeated Republican oligarch was his own body. He would not be conquered by the forgiveness of a tyrant. The Symposium of the Doomed. Evening descended, casting long, bruised shadows across the stone courtyards. Cato completed his final public obligations and returned to his private chamber. The room was entirely stripped of decorative excess. The physical space held only a bed, a small geometric mathematical table, and a scroll of papyrus. Before retreating into total isolation, He convened his friends, magistrates, and the philosophers who had accompanied him into exile. The air in the dining chamber was thick with unspoken grief, but Cato insisted on the formalities of a Roman dinner. The wine was poured, the bread was broken. The physical reality of the impending regime change hung in the air, yet the conversation turned, as it always did in Cato's presence, to philosophy. Among his guests were Apollonides the Stoic and Demetrius the Peripatetic. Instead of discussing military tactics, or the proximity of Caesar's vanguard, Cato steered the conversation toward the fierce, abstract domains of moral philosophy. The debate centered on the famous Stoic paradox, that only the good man is truly free, while all bad men are slaves. Then it came back, as these things will, to the Stoics and their idea that the philosopher alone cannot be compelled, that the tyrant's power is real but limited, that he can take property, take position, take life itself, but cannot, in the final account, take the will. As they argued the nuances, Cato's voice rose with a startling, passionate intensity. He vehemently defended the doctrine, his words striking like hammer blows in the quiet room. He did not speak of Caesar directly, but the implication resonated against the stone walls. The men at the table lowered their eyes. They understood that the abstract philosophy was a localized political verdict. Cato was classifying the unseen, approaching Caesar as a slave to his own ambition, and classifying the men in the room, who would soon bow to Caesar, as slaves to their own survival. Cato was not merely debating a philosophical abstract. He was delivering his own eulogy. He was preparing to prove the paradox with his own blood. When the dinner concluded, Cato embraced his son and his closest friends with an affection unusually warm for the stern Stoic. Then the heavy wooden doors closed him off from a world that had abandoned the laws of its ancestors. The philosophy of the blade. In the dim, flickering light of an oil lamp, Cato unrolled a papyrus scroll. It was Plato's Phaedo, the magnificent philosophical dialogue recounting the final hours of Socrates before his execution. As Caesar's cavalry drew ever closer to the city gates, Cato immersed himself in the immortal words of the Athenian philosopher. He read of how Socrates, surrounded by his weeping disciples, calmly debated the immortality of the soul. He absorbed the ancient argument that the body is merely a prison for the intellect, and that death is not a terror, but the ultimate liberation for the philosopher. Through the parchment, Socrates argued that the true philosopher spends his entire life preparing for death, and thus, when the moment arrives, he must meet it willingly. Cato anchored his impending actions in this profound ideological framework. Yet, when we cross-reference the ancient texts preserved in the archives, critical historiography demands caution. Writers like Plutarch, documenting these events a century and a half later, were deeply invested in dramatizing Stoic ideals. Many modern scholars interpret the inclusion of the Phaedo not as a documented historical fact, but as a literary interpolation, a deliberate effort to cast Cato as the Roman Socrates, elevating a brutal political suicide to the realm of philosophical martyrdom. What happened next, however, transcends literary embellishment and descends into the visceral reality of physical destruction. The severed tether. Halfway through his reading, Cato reached for his scabbard, which usually hung by the head of his bed. His hand met empty air. His son and his friends, suspecting his intentions, after the fiery dinner debate, had secretly removed his sword from the chamber. The realization that he was being managed, that his agency over his own life was being denied by those who loved him, ignited a rare and explosive fury within the Stoic. He called out into the hall, his voice trembling with a rare, explosive fury. He demanded that a servant bring him his sword. No servant moved. He called out a second time, the volume of his voice increasing. The servants remained paralyzed. Cato rose from the bed and walked to the doorway, finding an enslaved attendant standing near the threshold. Cato did not issue a third verbal command. In a sudden burst of violent frustration, he drove his right fist directly into the mouth of the servant. The physical impact crushed the monk's lips against his own teeth. Cato struck the face with such unguarded, violent force that the bones in his own hand bruised instantly. The knuckles swelled. He raised his voice to a deafening volume, shouting into the corridor. He declared that his own son and his servants were betraying him, delivering him into the hands of the enemy without arms. His son and his friends, who rushed into the room weeping and pleading with him to preserve his life. He rebuked them with icy authority. Did they think they could keep him alive by force? Demetrius and Apollonides stepped slowly into the room. They looked at the swollen hand of the senator. They began to shed tears. Cato offered no words of comfort, arguing that to deprive a Roman noble of his sword was an insult to his dignity. He stared at them and demanded the blade. Demetrius and Apollonides turned away, walking slowly out of the chamber, tears falling from their faces. The sun remained until the absolute physical immobility of the older man forced him to recognize the futility of his resistance. He released his grip and left the room. Time passed in the silent chamber. A young boy finally entered, carrying the heavy, metallic Roman sword. Cato took the iron by the hilt, drew the blade from its scabbard, and inspected the metal in the lamplight. He ran his eyes along the edge. The edge was still sharp. The point was keen. He looked at the weapon in his hands and spoke aloud to the empty room. Now I am my own master. The sleep of the unyielding. The tension evaporated from his body. He placed the naked sword down beside him, picked up the scroll of the Phaedo, and resumed his reading from beginning to end for a second time. He finished the text, set the papyrus down, and lay back upon the bed. He closed his eyes and fell into a profound, heavy, resonant slumber. The anxious men standing outside the wooden doors heard him snoring aloud. They stood in the stone corridor and listened to the rhythmic, unbothered breathing. It was the breathing of a man who had entirely conquered his fear of the void, concluding his negotiations with the physical world. Near the hour of dawn, the first pale light of morning began to bleed over the Mediterranean horizon. The birds of Utica began to sing, and then the snoring stopped. Cato woke in the dark. He called out toward the corridor. He summoned two specific men. He called for Clementia, the physician. He called for Botched, his chief agent in public matters. The two men entered the chamber. Cato looked at Botched. He gave a final logistical order. He instructed the freedmen to go down to the port. Botched was to visually confirm if all the evacuation ships had successfully departed the harbor. Botched nodded. He turned and left the room. He instructed the physician, Clementia, to bandage his injured hand. Witnessing the doctor tend to his wound, those around him felt a wave of relief, mistakenly believing that Cato had abandoned all thoughts of death and found the will to live. Clementia turned and walked out into the hall. Cato was finally alone. The botched strike. He reached out with his right hand. The knuckles were highly inflamed from the blunt impact against the servant's teeth. The grip strength was deeply compromised by the swelling of the tissues. He grasped the hilt of the sword, positioned the sharp, keen point beneath his ribs directly against his own abdomen, and drove the blade forward, thrusting upward into his flesh. The swollen hand failed to deliver the necessary kinetic force. The blade pierced the skin, tearing into the abdominal cavity, but it did not strike the heart. It did not sever the primary vessels. The physical shock ripped through his nervous system. His body convulsed against the intrusion of the steel. Gasping, he struggled and twisted upon the mattress, fighting the metal embedded in his torso. The violent, uncontrolled movement shifted his center of gravity, and he slipped from the edge of the bed. As his body plummeted toward the stone floor, his weight struck the geometric mathematical abacus. The heavy wooden table toppled over, crashing heavily against the floor stones. The metallic clatter and his muffled groans shattered the dawn silence, echoing sharply out into the corridor. The rejection of Clementia. The waiting servants heard the crash and cried out in immediate panic. His son burst through the heavy wooden doors, followed by his friends, Buddhas, and the physician Clementia. They stopped entirely, greeted by a portrait of unimaginable horror. Cato lay writhing on the cold stones of the floor, weltering in a massive, expanding pool of his own dark blood. His eyes were rolled back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. A great portion of his bowels had spilled out of his body through the jagged, imperfect incision in his abdomen. The wet, coiled intestines rested heavily on the masonry. Yet, astonishingly, he was not dead. He was entirely conscious. His heart still beat with the stubborn vitality of a Roman soldier. He looked up at his son, looked at the men staring at him in absolute, paralyzed horror. Then he shifted his gaze downward, looking directly at his own spilled bowels. Clementia the physician broke the paralysis. Weeping at the sight of his master, he stepped forward, knelt down into the pooling blood, and commanded the attendants to hold Cato down. He examined the severe anatomical trauma, and saw that while the bowels were exposed to the air, they were not pierced. The structural integrity of the intestines remained intact. Clementia produced his medical instruments, carefully washing the blood from the organs. He prepared to push the unpierced internal organs back into the abdominal cavity. He began to rapidly stitch the torn flesh together with medical sutures. He was attempting to stop the bleeding, to drag Cato back from the shores of the underworld. It was to save the life of the senator, so that Gaius Julius Caesar might arrive the next day and grant him his famous Clementia. For a moment, as the physician worked his needle, Cato lay unconscious. But the pain of the suturing brought him back from the darkness. He opened his eyes, staring up at the ceiling of the Utican villa. He felt the tight pull of the threads against his skin. He saw the hands reaching for his exposed organs. He understood the medical reality, and he felt the immense, suffocating political weight of the intervention. His friends, out of a misplaced sense of love, were condemning him to the very fate he had sought to escape. To be sewn together was to be handed over to Caesar alive. Caesar would stand over his bed, feign sorrow, and publicly grant him his life. Cato would become a living trophy, a neutered symbol of the old republic, paraded as a breathing prop in Caesar's grand theater of mercy. In that moment of realization, Cato summoned a terrifying, inhuman surge of willpower. He recovered his physical balance, pushing his torso upward from the wet floor with a sudden, violent convulsion. He raised his uninjured hand and thrust cleans away, physically striking the physician back from the blood. Cato looked down at his own open abdomen. He reached down with his bare, bloodied hands, bypassing the fallen sword. He violently tore at the fresh sutures. The threads snapped. Before the physician could restrain him again, Cato drove his fingers directly into his own open, bleeding wound. He grabbed his own unpierced bowels, gripping the slippery, coiled organs, and he pulled. He plucked his own intestines outward, tearing at the tissue with his own fingers. He violently widened the wound, physically ripping the flesh and the internal structures apart with brute force. He tore his own body open, exacerbating the trauma, deliberately and irreversibly ceasing his own biological functions. It was a violent reclamation of ultimate agency. By rendering his body a destroyed, unlivable vessel, he definitively denied the dictator his prize. He ripped at the coils, until the catastrophic systemic shock eradicated his consciousness. The body collapsed entirely against the stones. The hands went slack inside the ruin of his own torso. The sun stood frozen in the doorway. The physician remained pushed back against the wall. The sword lay abandoned on the floor. The mathematical table remained overturned, and the scroll of Plato rested silently on the bed. Cato died bathed in blood, an uncompromising martyr for a political system that was little more than a corpse. An empire of ghosts. The sheer biomechanical horror of this act has fueled academic debate for centuries. Does the manual extraction of the intestines represent a literal, historical fact, or is it a posthumous hagiographical exaggeration designed to contrast Cato's absolute control over his own body with the suffocating political reality of Caesar's dominance? The precise physiological mechanics may remain veiled by time, but the outcome is undisputed. The moment Cato's heart stopped in Utica, a new and formidable ghost was born into Roman history. Almost immediately, a fierce historiographical war erupted over his corpse. Marcus Tullius Cicero, the great orator, wrote a passionate political panegyric simply titled Cato, constructing the ultimate martyr for the Republic. The text proved so dangerous, so ideologically potent, that Julius Caesar, now the undisputed master of the Roman world, was forced to pause his administration to write the Anticato, a desperate attempt to dismantle the emerging myth and justify his own actions. He wrote it, a point-by-point rebuttal of the panegyric Cicero had composed in Cato's memory, a bitter cataloging of Cato's stubbornness, his drinking, his personal failures, his political mistakes. He wrote it with care, because he could not pardon a dead man. Yet, the document did not survive in full. Cato's reputation survived intact. Cato read Phaedo. Others read ledgers in Utica, later in Rome. While Cato chose myth and death, others chose Clementia and survival. The irony is, it was this pragmatic acceptance of mercy, not Cato's dramatic suicide, that allowed the Republicans to survive long enough to physically butcher Caesar. When Caesar finally breached the gates of Utica and learned of the gruesome suicide, the conqueror of the world was visibly shaken. Finding no political opponent to forgive, but only the butchered, hollowed-out remains of a man who had physically dismantled his own anatomy rather than submit to a pardon, Caesar recognized the brilliant, devastating political checkmate Cato had achieved from beyond the veil of death. He had wanted Cato alive. This was not simply personal. A pardoned Cato was the definitive proof of Caesar's magnanimity. It would have been the most complete demonstration that even his most irreconcilable enemy had been brought within the shelter of his mercy. It would have been the crown of the whole project. Cato, in his toga, alive and theoretically free, owed his life to Caesar's forbearance. That was the image Caesar needed. That was the story that would write itself across the remaining years of the Republic's slow dissolution. Plutarch records Caesar crying out in frustration, "O Cato, I grudge you your death, as you have grudged me the preservation of your life." Cato's corpse became an untouchable monument to the Republic that Caesar could not pardon, could not bribe, and could not assimilate. The Roman Republic was definitively buried under that localized pile of viscera. Cato's death at Utica definitively marked the burial of the Roman Republic. It formalized the transition to autocracy. He ensures that he dies a free man of the Republic, leaving Caesar to rule over a profoundly altered state. He achieved a moral victory that left Caesar with a Pyrrhic domination. Caesar achieved total military and political victory, but he was denied the moral surrender of his greatest ideological enemy. He possessed the Senate, the legions, and the treasury. Yet the state he now commanded was populated solely by men who had agreed to survive at the cost of their freedom. The remaining senators of Rome practiced the subtle art of lowering their eyes when the dictator entered the room. He was left to reign over an empire of ghosts, forever shadowed and haunted by the memory of a man who found his ultimate freedom in a torn abdomen. Cato's death was a defining cultural trauma, an act of unyielding defiance that would echo through centuries of European thought. It was immortalized in the tragic plays of the Renaissance and the dramatic classical paintings that attempt to capture the terrifying resolve of Rome's last free man. The fanatic, unyielding stoicism of a dead aristocratic era was permanently extinguished in the blood on the floor. The Roman Republic fell at Utica, not with the clash of armies, but with the quiet, devastating sound of tearing flesh. Caesar won. He returned to Rome, accepted the 4 triumphs, sat in the dictator's chair. The Senate gave him titles. The crowds gave him noise. He had no living enemy left to name. Then he wrote. The Anticato took weeks. A man who had crossed the Rubicon and broken the Republic in an afternoon spent his administrative hours composing a rebuttal to a corpse. The scroll reached Rome. The Romans read it. Then they read the Cato again. A dead man's hand had found the sword.